The river was slow that evening, molasses thick and tinted like rust beneath the dying sun. It carried the weight of things unspoken, dragging twigs, forgotten prayers, and the sound of breath swallowed by shame. When they pulled the widow from the water, her dress clung to her like memory, soaked and sagging as if even the fabric knew it was not wanted. She did not scream. She did not beg. She only blinked once against the dusk and sat upright on the mudbank, her silence heavier than any bullet. No one offered a hand. No one dared. They stood in a loose crescent, boots stirring the dirt, avoiding each other's eyes. The preacher's wife clutched her shawl tighter. A boy with freckles picked up a stone and then thought better of it. Reuben Sykes, all bristle and bile, stood with his arms crossed, the tips of his fingers stained with tobacco and worse. She weren't no good to him anyhow, he muttered, to no one in particular, but the words slithered through the crowd like something sacred, something final. Her husband had been gone 6 weeks now, shot off his saddle in a cattle raid, too far from town for prayers, too quick for regrets. They buried what was left and held a service without a nameplate, as if erasing him would erase the strange, quiet woman he'd taken for a wife. Nobody knew where she'd come from. One day she was there, watching from the ridge as the townsfolk rode into Sunday service. Veil drawn over her face, she spoke little, smiled less. When Reuben asked where his brother had found her, the man only shrugged and said, "She's got no one. Now she's got me." But now he was gone, and the river had nearly claimed her. And Reuben, who had never liked the way she stood too still or how she never flinched when he yelled, decided grief could only be soothed by something righteous. Drowning her wasn't murder, it was correction. The preacher did not speak against it. The lawman had looked the other way. The townsfolk told themselves she had stepped into the current of her own will, forgetting the bruises along her wrists, and the way her eyes never met theirs. She didn't speak as she stood, water slipping from her like a second skin. Her hair hung in ropes down her back, dark as mourning cloth. She looked up the bank to the road that led to nowhere in particular, and she walked. Not fast, not aimless, just forward. They let her go. Her cabin sat at the edge of the cottonwoods, near where the river hooked like a crooked finger. The place sagged from disrepair, the shutters half-hinged, a chicken coop long since empty. She lit a single lamp inside, its flame flickering behind the warped glass. No smoke rose from the chimney. No song escaped her lips. In the following days, she became a ghost that breathed. She fetched water before dawn, when the air still held the hush of night. She walked barefoot, left no prints. Children said they saw her talking to the river, whispering secrets into its slow-moving spine. Women told their husbands she stirred ill fortune just by walking past. Reuben spat every time her name was mentioned. They never used her name, only the widow, as if grief stripped her of her identity, and they preferred it that way. The town turned its face. At the mercantile, her coins were taken in silence. At the chapel, the pew beside her remained empty. Once, when she tried to leave bread on the preacher's doorstep, it was returned with a rock lodged in the middle. Even the dogs did not follow her. But the river, it remembered. It curved near her home like a protective arm, murmuring at night, beneath her window. Sometimes she sat at its edge, sleeves rolled, watching minnows dart between her fingers. Once she placed a small wooden carving on the current, a likeness of a horse whittled by a dead man's hand. She watched it vanish downriver, her face unreadable. It was on such a morning, when dew clung to every blade of grass and the sky had not yet chosen its color, that the dust trail appeared. It came from the south, a thin thread rising where no road should be, coiling like smoke against the horizon. It caught the widow's eye as she stood ankle-deep in the river, bucket in hand. She squinted once, then returned to filling her pail. The trail grew thicker, closer, as the sun stretched above the hills. The rider came with the stillness of someone who had seen too much to fear what was ahead. His hat was wide-brimmed, his coat worn at the seams, the edges of his boots kissed by red dust. A rifle lay slung across his back, untouched. His horse moved with care, as if it knew silence was part of its rider's nature. He passed the widow's cabin without looking. She did not wave. He did not slow. By mid-morning he was at the town's edge, tying his reins to the rail outside the saloon. The townsfolk watched from shaded windows and behind drawn curtains. His presence unsettled something long dormant, like a storm forming beyond sight, but close enough that every lung felt its pull. Reuben, drunk on morning whiskey and old pride, stepped onto the boardwalk. "You're lost, stranger." The man looked at him, slow and quiet, like the way an old man reads an epitaph. Then he turned, walked into the saloon, and did not speak. Later he bought supplies, flour, nails, a coil of rope, and laid silver coins down without asking for change. The storekeeper would later say his hands were calloused in a way that meant he'd held more than just weapons. He said nothing of who he was or why he'd come, but when he walked past the chapel, he paused. Not long. Just enough. By dusk he was gone again, this time down the river trail, past the place where Reuben had watched his brother's wife pulled from the current, past the cottonwoods, toward the crooked cabin where the lamp still burned. The widow stood on the porch, arms folded, watching. He tipped his hat once. She did not respond, and still, something shifted. It was not affection, not trust, but a pause in the ache, a breath drawn, not out of fear but curiosity. He did not knock. He did not stay, but the river stirred behind him and the dusk grew a little less heavy, and the widow, for the first time in weeks, did not eat alone. She left a second plate out that night, untouched but waiting, just in case. The man called Elias Thorne returned to the town the next morning, just as the shadows of the cottonwoods had begun to shorten under a rising sun. He rode in without urgency, his shoulders loose, gaze fixed on something distant. Something only he could see. His horse, a lean bay with one ear notched, moved like it had no fear left in it. Dust clung to them both, soft and pale like old bones. He tied the reins outside the saloon again, though the doors had not yet been pushed open for the day. Inside, a single oil lamp burned low, its flame dancing in the haze of last night's smoke. The barkeep, a man who knew the weight of silence better than most, nodded once and slid a chipped mug down the counter. Elias caught it with a hand roughened by years of cold trigger steel and harder seasons. No words were exchanged. The barkeep didn't ask his business. Men like Elias came in from the long trail every so often, ghosts in leather skin, breathing, dust and secrets. But this one carried something different. He watched the door more than the mirror. He didn't drink the whiskey. He only warmed his hands on the cup. Outside, the town slowly remembered its shape. The blacksmith's hammer rang out. The preacher's bell called the children into morning scripture, and the widow, in her usual way, walked to the well in silence, her veil drawn low even in the growing heat. She did not glance toward the saloon as she passed. Elias, seated by the front window, watched her with a gaze that asked nothing, offered nothing. He only looked like a man trying to remember a tune he'd once heard in a dream. Reuben Sykes saw it all. He leaned against the rail across the street, thumb hitched into his belt loop, jaw working a piece of jerky like it was a grudge. His eyes followed Elias with that particular fire reserved for men who arrived without explanation, but carried too much calm to be harmless. He'd seen that look before, on his brother, in the weeks before he married her. That stillness that came from knowing exactly what you wanted and daring the world to argue with you. "You picked a strange town to stop in, friend," Reuben called out. Elias didn't turn. He took another slow sip from his cup, then set it down as if measuring its weight against the air. Reuben spat into the dirt, crossed the street in 5 short strides, and stood square in the doorway. "You deaf or just dumb?" he asked. Elias stood, not fast, not slow, just deliberate. He looked at Reuben the way a man looks at weather, considering whether it's worth braving or waiting out. "I ain't looking for trouble," Elias said, his voice low, worn around the edges. "That so?" Reuben stepped in close enough that the tips of his boots brushed against Elias's. "Then don't look at her like you know her." "I don't," Elias replied. "Not yet." It wasn't the words that stung. It was the simplicity of them. Like truth laid bare with no need for drama. Reuben's nostrils flared. His hand drifted toward the butt of his pistol. Elias didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. "Leave it," came a voice from behind the bar. The barkeep, still polishing a glass, spoke without raising his eyes. "Not in here." Reuben stepped back, the tension still in his spine. But the moment passed like a storm that hadn't found its lightning. He turned and walked out without another word, his boots heavy on the planks. Elias sat back down, finished his drink, and left 2 silver coins on the counter. By midday, word had spread. The stranger had spoken to Reuben twice and lived. The widow had not acknowledged him, but the way she passed him near the well and the way she didn't flinch when his hand brushed the rope as she drew her bucket was noticed. It was enough to feed gossip for a week. Later that afternoon, Elias walked the outer edge of town, past the chapel, past the store, past where children played marbles under the watchful eye of mothers who stopped talking when he passed. He moved, like a man who had walked more roads than he'd known homes, his boots carrying the memory of every town that had failed to offer rest. He stopped once, just once, at the widow's gate. The latch was hanging crooked, half torn from the post, by time or temper. He didn't knock. He didn't speak. He reached into his saddlebag, pulled out a small metal hinge and a handful of nails and fixed it. No note, no expectation. He simply restored what had been broken, then left the way he'd come. That evening, the widow found the repaired latch. She ran her fingers along the edge, noting the precision. She didn't smile, but her shoulders softened, and for the first time in many nights, the lamp in her cabin burned a little longer. In the days that followed, Elias stayed near. Not imposing, just near. He helped the blacksmith load iron, traded his coat for grain, and once, without being asked, he fixed the axle on the storekeeper's cart. Each act was quiet, deliberate, and left behind no signature but silence. He never once returned to the saloon. The widow watched all of it. She said nothing, but once she placed a small loaf of cornbread on her porch rail at dawn. When she returned at noon, it was gone, and in its place was a folded piece of paper, blank but for a single pressed wildflower tucked inside. The town, sensing something unspoken, bristled. A woman who had been all silence and shadow now had. A shadow who stood in sunlight, and they didn't know what to make of it. Reuben especially festered. He drank more. He spoke louder in the saloon. He swore the man was up to something. Said no one fixed fences or hinges without asking for a thing unless they were soft in the head or up to no good. But the widow wasn't listening. And one night, as the sky bled purple behind the hills, Elias returned to her porch. She opened the door before he could knock. They looked at each other for a long time. No words, no gestures, just breath between them. Then he stepped forward, not past her, just near enough that his voice could carry with no one else to hear. "She's my wife now," he said, quiet and steady. Behind him, a figure stirred in the shadows. Reuben, half drunk, fists clenched. But the widow didn't look past Elias. She stepped outside, stood beside him, and placed one hand on the railing. Elias didn't move. He waited, and she said nothing. But she did not go back inside, and, in this place, that silence was louder than any vow. It was a week after Elias Thorne first stood on her porch when the wind changed, the kind of change that rattled old bones and unsettled doors long since shut, the kind of change that made men pause mid-step and squint into the distance, as if, waiting for a storm they could not see but surely felt. Elias had taken to rising early before even the crows stirred. He would saddle his horse slow, deliberate, like each buckle and strap needed remembering. He never said where he rode, only that he'd be back before dusk. And true to his word, he always was. She had begun to expect him in small ways. A coffee cup left on the porch rail, a coil of rope unknotted, a patch of garden weeded with care. They did not speak much. Their language was in the glances and gestures, in the quiet moments between tasks, in the echo of his bootsteps beside hers as they fetched water from the river. It was in the way he stood when she worked, never in her way, but never far either. And still, they were not yet known to each other. Not fully. The widow, still unnamed in town, kept her distance even as her eyes lingered longer, even as her shoulders relaxed when she saw him walking back from wherever the trail had taken him. Her grief had been a cloak too long worn, and, even as it frayed, she wasn't yet ready to shrug it off entirely. Not for him, not for anyone, but Elias never pressed. It was this stillness between them, this unspoken pact, that began to gnaw at Reuben like rot in the foundation. He watched the man become part of her world, not through declarations but by small, sturdy acts. He watched the town begin to shift in subtle ways, the way the barkeep set out an extra cup, the way the preacher nodded curtly when Elias passed, the way the children whispered less about the widow's cursed house and more about the stranger who fixed what he touched. Reuben couldn't stand it. It wasn't just that she lived. It was that she seemed stronger, that her eyes no longer drifted downward when folks passed, that her steps were more certain, that she smiled faintly when Elias handed her a bundle of dried lavender and said, without flourish, "For the windows. Keeps flies out." That small smile burned a hole in Reuben's pride. So when the travelers arrived, dust-covered men in patched dusters with hard eyes and the look of vagrants who knew the weight of violence, Reuben saw his chance. They rode in 2 days before the rain broke, their horses lathered and restless, their boots too clean for honest work. The saloon took them in, of course. Money was money, even when it came from rough hands and untrustworthy mouths. Their leader, a wiry man with a scar slicing his brow in two, introduced himself as Lyle Kate. He didn't smile when he spoke, and folks noticed how he always sat with his back to a wall. Kate asked questions. Not directly. But he asked, who was the stranger? Where'd he come from? Why'd he stay? And Reuben, already lit from liquor and envy, told him the man had been cozying up to the widow, that he claimed she was his wife now, as if those words were sacred. Told them the stranger was hiding something, that a man like that don't fix things for free unless he's done something worth running from. Kate listened, and when he finally spoke, it was with a voice quiet as dust. A man like that don't deserve peace. The next day, the widow found a dead bird nailed to her door. It wasn't large, a sparrow maybe, but its wings were stretched wide and pinned flat against the wood, its chest torn open like a warning. She stared at it without moving for a long time. Then, slowly, she lifted a cloth from her apron and unpinned the tiny creature with delicate fingers. She wrapped it gently, as if it still breathed, and buried it beneath the cottonwood where her husband had once built a bench. Elias arrived minutes later. He said nothing at first, only crouched at the freshly turned soil, ran a hand across the bark of the tree, and rose. "They want you afraid," he said. "I'm not," she answered, though her voice trembled. "They'll push harder." She looked at him then, truly, looked, at the scars along his knuckles, at the way the sun caught the silver just beginning in his hair, at the quiet way he stood like someone who had learned the hard way that storms cannot always be outrun. "I don't want to be afraid anymore," she said. He gave a small nod. Nothing more, but in his eyes something shifted. Not pity, not protection, something closer to recognition. That night, Elias did not leave her porch. He sat there, rifle across his knees, eyes fixed on the darkness that lay just beyond the lantern light. The widow made no protest. She brought him coffee when the wind grew colder and sat beside him, shoulder to shoulder, in the kind of silence that feels like safety. They did not speak of the past, but he did tell her his name. "Elias Thorne," he said as if the words might splinter in the air. She took them gently. The next morning the gossip came swift. "They say he's wanted in Texas. He's killed men, left them bleeding in the sand. She's keeping him in her house now, no shame. Maybe she bewitched him. Maybe she's cursed. The townsfolk said much but did nothing. The barkeep served him still. The preacher looked away. The lawman pretended not to see. Only Reuben moved with purpose. He whispered into Kate's ear, gestured toward the riverbank, toward the widow's house. And Kate, slow as syrup and cold as iron, nodded. That evening, a shot rang, out, not near town, far toward the edge of the trees. Elias was gone in an instant, running toward the sound, his rifle ready. The widow followed, breath tight in her chest, the hem of her dress catching on thorns. They found the chicken coop burned, to ash, nothing left but cinders and the smell of oil. He turned to her. They want you scared, alone. She met his eyes. They're going to be disappointed. In that moment, under a bruised sky and the stench of smoke, something inside her hardened, not bitter, not broken, but forged. And he saw it. He reached for her hand. She did not pull away. "I'll stay," he said, "if you'll have me." She did not answer, but she didn't let go. That night, the lantern in her cabin glowed long past midnight. And for the first time, the town could see two shadows moving inside. The morning came with an unnatural hush, as though the wind itself had chosen to hold its breath. Even the crows stayed quiet, perched like sentinels on fence posts, watching the dust drift lazily over the rooftops. Something was coming. The widow felt it before she opened her eyes, a tightness in the chest, the kind that presses down and doesn't let go. Elias was already outside, seated on the porch with his back straight and his hands still. He looked not at the road, but at the tree. He hadn't slept. She knew it without asking. His coffee sat untouched, steam long since vanished. "They were close last night," he said, his voice soft and low. She didn't ask how he knew. She trusted he could feel it the way a wounded animal knows when the hunter's breath is near. She poured water into the basin beside the door, washed her hands slowly, carefully, like ritual. When she handed him a cloth, he took it gently like it was made of memory. "They're not going to stop," he added. "I don't want them to," she replied, surprising herself. He turned to her, studying her face, not the way a man looks at a woman, but the way a soldier might look at home after too many winters on the run, as if seeing her steadiness steadied something in him. She nodded toward the coop. They burned what they thought mattered. They don't know what matters. No, more was said between them, but there was a current beneath their quiet, something sharp and full of heat. She saw the wear on his face, the way time had carved deep lines at the corners of his eyes, and yet the storm in him remained focused, waiting. The town had turned its back for good now. After the coop fire, no one came to help, not even with words. Doors stayed closed when she passed. Whispers bloomed like weeds behind her steps. Mothers pulled children close. Even the preacher's smile shrank when she looked his way. But the widow didn't shrink. Not anymore. Elias had given her no promises, only presence. And in that presence, something in her had remembered its shape. The shape of a woman who had survived worse than whispers, who'd buried her husband alone, who'd bled for this land with her own calloused hands. She would not cower now. Reuben Sykes did not take it well. He drank deeper each night, grew meaner in the mornings. Kate and his men were holed up in the back room of the saloon, sharpening blades and folding whispers into plans. Reuben hovered like a shadow, always near but never quite belonging. They tolerated him the way fire tolerates dry brush, useless until it becomes useful. "I want to be there," he told Kate one night, voice thick with liquor. "When it ends." Kate, eyes gleaming like ice under moonlight, studied him. "You'll get your wish," he said. That night, Elias stood watch again, rifle beside him. The widow didn't light the lamp. She sat just inside the doorway, listening to the night sing its dark lullaby. The crickets seemed louder now, the trees restless, in the wind. They were waiting. All of them. Just after midnight, they came. 4 shadows moving through the dark, careful steps muffled by the softness of dry earth. They didn't come through the road. They came through the trees, through the underbrush and over the creek. It was Kate, of course, and 2 of his men, and Reuben walking behind like a man following his own funeral. Elias was ready. He didn't fire, not at first. He waited until they reached the gate, waited until Kate reached for the latch Elias had once repaired with his own hands. Then he stepped out of the dark, like a ghost made flesh. "That's far enough," Elias said, his voice cutting clean through the night. Kate smiled. "Evenin', stranger, you're not welcome here. Didn't come for tea." The widow emerged behind Elias, rifle in hand, steady as stone. The moon caught the edge of her cheekbone and made her look like some wild myth walking out of a folk song. Her silence was its own kind of power. Kate's men shifted. The youngest one, maybe no more than 20, seemed to falter when he saw her. Reuben behind them said nothing, just stared, mouth slightly open. "Go back," Elias said. "This doesn't end the way you think." Kate stepped forward. "I heard what you said," he drawled. "She's your wife now, that true?" Elias didn't blink. "It's true," Kate spat into the dirt. "That's a mighty pretty claim for a woman who don't wear a ring." The widow raised her rifle an inch. "Just enough. I wear what I choose." Kate's smile thinned. "Ain't the way things are done." Elias raised his own rifle slow and measured. "Maybe the way things were." Kate's eyes narrowed. "You a lawman?" "No." "Then what are you?" Elias let the silence stretch before answering. "Tired." Kate moved first. The flick of a hand, a twitch in the eye. A blade glinted from one man's coat, but the widow fired before Elias did. The shot cracked the night in half. One of Kate's men dropped, clutching his shoulder with a howl. The youngest one turned and bolted into the trees, crashing like a startled deer. Elias moved like water, fluid, unhurried, deadly. His bullet found the second man's leg, sent him sprawling into the dust. Kate lunged, blade raised, but Elias was already inside his reach. They grappled, tight, brutal, breathless. Kate slammed Elias into the porch rail. Wood cracked. Blood bloomed at Elias's temple. But he did not fall. With a final furious twist, Elias drove his fist into Kate's jaw. Once, twice, until the man crumpled like wet paper. Only Reuben remained, standing stiff, gun half raised, sweat painting his forehead. Elias turned to him. "You want to finish this?" he asked. Reuben looked at the widow, then at the wounded men groaning in the dirt, at Kate, unmoving, and he lowered his gun. "No," he said. "I already lost." Then he dropped the pistol and disappeared into the dark. The sheriff came at dawn. There was no trial, no questions. Kate and his men were known. There'd be bounties collected. Reuben wasn't seen again, not for a long while. The town didn't speak of it, but things changed. The preacher nodded first. Then the blacksmith asked Elias for help with a wagon wheel. The children crept near again, eyes wide and curious. The saloon poured a drink in silence, and the barkeep finally said, "You stayin' then?" Elias didn't answer. He didn't have to. The widow fixed the porch rail with her own hands, hammering the nails in rhythm to the sound of Elias's voice reading aloud from a weathered book. She listened without saying much, sitting beside him as the afternoon sun melted into gold. She didn't wear a ring, but she wore her name like armor now. Elias built a bench beneath the cottonwood where the sparrow had been buried. He carved nothing into it, left it plain, like truth. One evening, long after the dust had settled, he turned to her. "You know," he said, "I meant what I said that night. I didn't say it to protect you. I said it because it felt true." She looked at him then, really looked, and in the soft hush between their breaths, she answered the only way she knew how. She reached for his hand and held on. The river ran high that spring, swollen with snowmelt from the distant mountains and heavy rains that had swept through the valley like a baptism. The water moved faster than it had in years, churning brown and loud, dragging broken branches and old ghosts with it. It was the kind of river that didn't ask permission, only took. The widow stood at its edge just past dawn, the hem of her dress dark with dew. She stared at the current as though it held something she'd forgotten, some echo of what she used, to be. Behind her, the land stirred with the quiet rituals of survival. A barn door creaking open, hens clucking low, Elias's boots crunching down the path toward her. He didn't speak. Just came to stand beside her, hands tucked into his coat, eyes steady on the water. "They came from this river," she said softly. "The ones who tried to end me. Same place they meant to send me under. I remember." She looked down at her hands. "Sometimes I still feel it. That weight. The hands on my back. The cold. The silence." Elias said nothing, but she felt the shift in him. That stillness that wasn't absence but listening. "I don't want it to own me," she said. "Not anymore." "It doesn't," he replied. She turned then, searching his face, not for answers but for confirmation that the ground she stood on was real, that she hadn't built her life again on something that could be washed away. The sound of hooves broke the quiet. A single rider cresting the hill to the east. Dust plumed behind him like smoke from a shot not yet heard. He was moving fast, urgent. They both knew, even before the rider slowed. Elias stepped forward. The widow stayed still. It was the sheriff's, boy panting, face red, eyes wide with something past fear. "It's Reuben," he gasped. "He's back. Got a posse with him, hired guns from Abilene." "How many?" Elias asked, already reaching for his rifle. "4, maybe 5, all mean. He's calling it justice. Says the widow put a bounty on Kate and his boys. Claims you're hiding a killer." The boy looked at the widow, shame heavy in his voice. "Says he's come to collect." Elias didn't flinch. He simply nodded and turned back toward the house. The widow followed. Inside, the air was quiet, thick with the scent of wood smoke and lavender. She moved without haste, retrieving her rifle from the mantel, checking the bullets the way her father had once taught her. Elias watched her, admiring, not the act itself, but the grace of it, the steadiness. There was no panic in her, only resolve. They didn't speak much as they prepared. There was no need. They knew each other now, in the way that mattered. The world might still doubt it, but in the hush of that small home, it was truth. By the time Reuben arrived, the sun had climbed halfway into the sky. He came at the head of his ragged crew like a man convinced the world owed him a reckoning. His coat was dust-streaked and open at the collar, revealing a tarnished deputy's badge. He had no claim to. The men behind him looked like they'd been pulled from the bottom of saloons. Grizzled, long-armed, dangerous in the way of animals. Elias stood on the porch, rifle slung but hands at his side. The widow stood behind him, not hidden, never hidden, but watchful. Reuben halted at the gate, grinning with too many teeth. "Didn't expect to see you standing so tall," he called out. "Thought by now you'd have run." Elias didn't move. "I don't run." Reuben's eyes slid past him to the widow. "You hid behind him long enough, time's up." "She's not hiding," Elias said. "She's standing right where she needs to be." Reuben's grin faltered, but only slightly. "I've got papers," he said, waving a folded parchment like it meant something. "State orders. Claims on the bounties." She took justice into her own hands. "That ain't how the law works." "There wasn't any law when Kate came to burn her life down." Reuben's voice sharpened. "You think you're above it? You think this little game of house makes you untouchable?" The widow stepped forward then, past Elias, her rifle cradled in her arms like a prayer book. "I think you're a coward," she said calmly. "And I think the law doesn't follow men like you, it follows fear." Reuben's face darkened. His hand twitched near his holster. Elias's voice was cold steel. "Don't. The tension stretched like wire between them. One wrong breath, and it would all break. "I'm not here to talk," Reuben growled. "I'm here to end this." Elias stepped down from the porch. "I warned you once. I won't do it again." Reuben drew. So did his men. But Elias moved like a story being rewritten. Smooth, sharp, certain. The first shot dropped one of Reuben's men before his gun left its holster. The second tore into the dust as Elias ducked behind the fence post. The widow fired next, catching a second man in the thigh. He screamed, fell sideways, his pistol clattering uselessly. The third and fourth spread out, trying to flank. Elias moved between them like a shadow cut loose. Close combat now. Fists and elbows, the rifle discarded for speed. The widow reloaded with shaking fingers, breath tight but even, tracking Reuben as he circled around the side of the house. She heard his boots hit the porch, heard the door creak open. She turned and followed. Inside, the house was dim. The curtains, drawn, dust hanging in slivers of sunlight. She found him in the kitchen, gun raised, eyes wild. "Put it down," she said. He laughed, a dry, cracked sound. "You think you're some kind of hero now? Some frontier saint? You think he loves you? You think that's real?" "I don't need him to save me," she said. "But I'll save myself." Reuben moved first. She fired. The shot echoed through the house like thunder in a church. He staggered back, eyes wide with disbelief, the gun falling from his fingers before he did. His body slumped into the chair her husband used to sit in. Fitting, somehow. Elias burst through the door seconds later, blood on his sleeve, jaw clenched. It was done. The law came later that day. Proper law, summoned by the sheriff who'd finally grown a spine. They took the bodies, asked questions, didn't press too hard when Elias and the widow told their side. Too many witnesses now. Too many folk willing to say the couple had protected themselves. In time, the dust settled. The fear that had haunted the widow for so long finally lifted like smoke after rain. She walked through town with her head high, and though some still whispered, more began to nod. Children waved, men tipped their hats. The preacher invited her to supper. Elias stayed, though he never made promises. He built a second bench beside the first, planted wildflowers near the riverbank, painted the front door sky blue. One night, beneath the stars, she turned to him and asked, "What would you have done if I hadn't taken that shot?" He looked at her, his gaze both heavy and light. "I would have taken it for you." She nodded, then took his hand and placed it over her heart. "You don't have to anymore." And he understood, not because she said the words, but because he felt the weight of them, because in her pulse was the truth, that she had found her strength not in him, but beside him, and in that truth, he found his own redemption. The river still ran high that year, but it no longer threatened. It sang, like a memory, like a promise, and, somewhere in that wind, where the cottonwoods whispered and the past finally let go, the widow and the gunslinger began again, not with vows, but with silence, the kind that holds forever.